Hello and welcome to another edition of Conversation With. I'm your host, Gary Smith, and today we're going to have a conversation with history. And what better person to bring on to talk about history and local history is my good friend, Marc Henshaw, archaeologist, historian, and probably most importantly for this conversation, Brownsville Catholic class of 1990 along with me. So Marc, welcome once again from your home in Michigan. How's everything going in the Mitten State?
Everything's going really well. Pandemic has me kind of bored, but field work's going to start going again, and hopefully we'll get back out in the field and start digging as soon as we can. I'm tired of snow. Want to be out on a motorcycle. Don't want to be riding a snowblower instead of the bike. You know what I mean?
Yeah. When me and Marc were setting this up, we were hoping that maybe the weather would be good enough that he could be on a GoPro on his motorcycle for this interview. But unfortunately, Michigan, as is Pennsylvania, the day we shoot this is still a little soggy and cold. But maybe whenever we talk next time, it'll be warm enough. But let's start with the genesis of this conversation is Marc and I, and like pretty much everyone on Earth, is online a lot and members of several Facebook groups, and we're members of the Brownsville Facebook group. And there's a couple things posted from historical sites that were a little inaccurate about the steamboat history in Brownsville. And Marc, as he'll explain in a second, is probably one of the top 5 experts in the world on steamboats in Brownsville. Actually, for steamboats in Brownsville, Marc, probably number 1. Steamboats in general, you're probably top 5. So, Marc, I'll let you run with the ball and just explain what some of the things and actuallys were and how we're going to just educate everybody on what the actual the facts are.
Great. There was this blog post that was produced by the National Road, and I understand that they don't have the ability to have all the details on writing the complete history of the Brownsville steamboat industry, or the ability to do massive amounts of research into that industry and present it. But there were some inaccuracies that I just wanted to address. And by doing that, I think we can actually learn something about the significance of Brownsville itself in the role of Western expansion. Our city, our town, I should say, was at one time at the forefront of the Western frontier. You can stand on the banks of the Monongahela River, really not know, or maybe have some idea of what's on the other side, who lived over there. And so Brownsville was this jumping off point all the way back, even during the French and Indian War in the 1750s. Boats were being constructed by Redstone, and flatboats, bateaus, things of that nature, for transportation to get to Pittsburgh. And so Brownsville really was this hub. And so in order to talk about the steamboat industry, we have to understand why it propped up in Brownsville, why this was such an important area. And Brownsville really had all the markings of something that was going to be greater than itself, okay? It was at the end of the National Road, the end of the Nemacolin Trail. If you wanted to get west, you had to come through Brownsville. If you were an immigrant from Philadelphia, Connecticut, where have you, ultimately you landed yourself on the National Road. And so that dumping off point was Brownsville. And all the way back into the 1780s, there were reports of immigrants weathering the winter, deep snows in their little shelters, lined up from Brownsville to Uniontown, waiting for the snow to melt and the freshets to set in so that they could pick up a flatboat in Brownsville and head west. So these were really people that were hardy. They were trying to make a better life for themselves outside the city of Philadelphia and those urban areas. And the West offered a lot of opportunity for them to do that, freedom, so to speak. But that freedom started with getting the boat. And getting the boat took a long time. Some of the first industries in Brownsville were sawmills. And naturally, with sawmills came boat building. Mm-hmm. And so you'd wait 6-7 weeks, longer, month maybe, 2 months, for your flatboat to get ready that you had commissioned or that you were going in on with several other families. And so that whole experience really built Brownsville up. So not only did you have, at that point, did you need flatboats and sawmills, but you also had to have industry to support all the pioneers coming through there. So foundries popped up. You need to buy your plows, you need to buy your stoves, everything you needed, your kit, so to speak, to set up your home in the West. Get outfitted in Brownsville, right? Nail manufacturers, foundries. You had all sorts of mercantile businesses. Pick up your blankets, your coats, things that your provisions, right? Butchers. And so it was only a matter of time before the merchants of Brownsville decided that, hey, we should really start shipping stuff.
And
Why
real
not have a
quick,
shipping industry?
and real quick, Mark, before you go into the next phase of your thing,
Sure.
I just want to double back and just for some of our younger viewers and people that may not be from the area, because we're used to driving. The mountains of Uniontown are really not an impediment unless it's the winter. But really, the Allegheny Mountains at one point, you had no idea what was going to be on the other side of them. So Brownsville really was that cosmopolitan frontier city where if you got to there, you basically could get to New Orleans and all points west. I don't think people realize how big of a deal it was just to make that trip and get to Brownsville. It's like that golden gem of the West where you can go west.
Yeah, we never think about the lives lost on that journey. We never think about the people who died in the mountains in wintertime, freezing to death. We never think about all the possible burials along the National Road of people who just didn't make it. Families, it was the frontier. There was nothing there. It's kind of interesting. Some of the early historians talk about the area surrounding Brownsville, about the maple trees as an industry. They said maple sugar or sugar derived from maple trees will compete with anything derived in the Caribbean, right? But that was an industry that really didn't take off. It didn't really, even with the abundance of maple trees, really didn't take off. But the resources for Brownsville are there, right? They're there. And so in the 1780s, there was a gentleman by the name of Jacob Yoder. And he was a merchant. And he loaded his flatboat full of, pardon me, my phone's going off.
Oh, believe me, we have all been, I think anyone watching this has been subject to the Zoom surprises through the past year, either dogs coming in, babies dropping in, or a phone. So you're good. So we'll pick up with.
It's quarantine. I'm surprised my cats aren't all. So to get back to Jacob Yoder, he had all this pottery, he had goods, and he wanted to sell them in a market that would buy them. And he decided to take his flatboat and go to New Orleans in it. And so he traveled from Brownsville, north up the Monongahela River, through Pittsburgh to the Ohio, down to New Orleans, sold his wares, sold his flatboat, bought a horse, horsed his way back to Brownsville. Took 6 months.
It's unbelievable now that you get on a plane and be in New Orleans in about 4 hours. So it just when you say things like that, just gives people the scope of what a commitment was, any kind of travel was. I mean, even going downtown to get something at Provisions was probably a day and a half journey.
Absolutely. Well, that's why taverns are every 12 miles on the National Road, because that was a one-day trip on a horse. So you go from one tavern to the next, get your provisions until you finally made it to Brownsville or wherever you were going. So, the idea of traveling from Brownsville to Pittsburgh, which is 12 miles, would take a day, basically. You had several stops you could make. And so these immigrants coming into Brownsville to get their flatboats, they were, and their provisions, were, of course, driving the industry, right? And in Bridgeport, which is what's now known as South Brownsville, originally Brownsville was 3 towns, Bridgeport, Brownsville Borough, and West Brownsville. Bridgeport and Brownsville being separated by the cast iron bridge, Dunlap's Creek separating it, was settled primarily by Quakers in the 1770s, somewhere around there, large Quaker population. And, for another video, we could talk about how Quakerism really fostered the Industrial Revolution. We'll save that for later. But there are two Quakers of note. There's Elijah Hunt and his brother Caleb, and they owned a mercantile business in Brownsville. They do the same journey Jacob Yoder did. Okay. It didn't take them quite as long, but they did the same journey. And after doing that, they decide they want to start a business. Okay. So they're trying to figure out what to do. Now, during this time period, around 1811, and this is where we're going to segue into the blog post article. Okay. Little history. 1807, Robert Fulton built the Clermont. Okay. It's a revolutionary steamboat. It was large. It had low pressure steam engines. It was sailed around a lake in central Pennsylvania. Really revolutionized transportation, right? He really did sort of start the spark of this. The blog post mentioned that he invented the steam engine. Okay. Let's address this right now. Steam engine was not invented by Robert Fulton. Okay. We can say the steamboat was invented by Robert Fulton. The steam engine had been around since the 1770s. They were British, the Newcomen engines. They were atmospheric engines, low pressure. And then after them with Boulton and Watt steam engines, also low pressure, with these walking beams, the beam engines. And so these beam engines, right? Robert Fulton used those. They were low pressure. They were large machinery. The Clermont had two side wheels positioned midships. And so he forms a company, all right? Because he also has the idea that, hey, there's money being made in New Orleans. And so his company gets set up in Pittsburgh. Okay, and it's comprised of three people. Fulton, his partner Livingston, who helped fund the first steamboat, and Roosevelt, who was actually related to President Roosevelt down the chain. Fulton doesn't really, he may travel to Pittsburgh, but he doesn't stay there. He leaves it up to Roosevelt to do most of the work. And they built a steamboat called the New Orleans in 1811. And the New Orleans is a low-pressure steamboat. Steamboats at this time look like ships, sailing ships. They had a deep V hull. They had a prominent bow and a stern, paddle wheels mounted midships, and they had a sail. Okay, and their boilers were mounted vertically. Okay, and they had the walking beam sort of engine. Maybe one deck, main deck, the boiler deck, and then your pilot house. Okay, and so Roosevelt takes his whole family, and they travel down to New Orleans. Up the Ohio. The Ohio at the time had waterfalls by Louisville, so they had to wait for the freshets when the water was high in the spring or in the fall. And on their journey, they really encounter, it's a fascinating journey. Okay, if you ever get a chance to read a diary, it's absolutely fascinating because they ended up getting near New Orleans when the New Madrid earthquake strikes.
Okay? Oh, jeez. Talk about bad timing.
Oh, well, just wait. This is the most awesome story you'll ever hear. They're traveling in their steamboat down the Mississippi River, and there's a comet in the sky that's visible. Okay? It's been visible for several days. The New Madrid earthquake hits. And it's so powerful that mud geysers shoot up along the banks of the river. Native American villages are being destroyed. They're running, and they see all this from the steamboat, right? The earthquake was also so powerful, it forced the Mississippi River to flow backwards. Tie that with the largest squirrel migration in the history at that time, where they see all these squirrels diving into the river to their deaths.
Oh, my goodness.
You've got the makings of an apocalyptic scenario that everybody on that boat thought was happening. They thought the world was ending. Villages on fire, mud geysers, water flowing backwards, comet in the sky, largest squirrel migration happening.
Has this diary been published in books, or is it more academic research?
You know what?
That's something I would love to get my hands on.
You can find it on Google Books for free.
Okay. Sounds good.
It's a diary.
Because if nothing else comes out of this conversation, I'm going to redo some history of the squirrel migration. But you kind of, I was going to chime in there a second when you were talking about the hulls. But shipbuilders in those days kind of had to be visionaries too, because you might build a ship in Brownsville or Pittsburgh to get to New Orleans, but there's probably, a half a dozen different terrain or channel considerations they had to make. What was that like? I mean, how esteemed were the designers and the engineers of their day?
Well, we're going to get to that.
Okay, because I was going to say, because now you think you just see barges and everything, like, hey, they're going up and down the river, but the without locks and dams in those days, the river, wasn't navigatable all the time.
You had to wait for high water.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, okay, so you had two major boats on the river at this time period. You had the flatboat and you had the keel boat. Okay, flatboats were great because if you're an immigrant, you bought your flatboat in Brownsville, went to out west down to Mississippi, and then you tore the flatboat apart and built your house out of it. Okay? That's
amazing.
Yeah,
just that ingenuity that has been lost to time.
Yeah, so you had all your provisions. You had a ready-made. This is the stuff NASA is talking about now for Mars, right? Turning their spaceships into the habitation module when they land. I mean, this was going on for centuries already, right? So the other type of boat was the keel boat. Much more rigidly built. It was also like a boat. It wasn't flat-bottomed. It had a hull that was a V hull. It could carry a large amount of tonnage. It was made for commerce, all right? And it carried a big crew. You could get down the rivers on these things very easily. Flatboats only went one way, all right? The keel boat was meant to go both ways. Now, how did you do this? Well, for one thing, you had a pole. You had men with poles that would literally pull the boat up the river, okay? The other was called warping. And warping was by pulling tree branches along the river and pulling the boat, okay? These guys, I mean, talk about strength being keelboat. Not only that, but you had to worry about the rapids, water level. You could get hung up for months, weeks, right? There were river pirates. Oh,
yeah, if you're pulling a boat, you're a slow moving target. If you're trying to go upstream, I can't imagine the chaos and the fear and just the frontier ingenuity of just like how the people that built this country had to survive.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to tell you, the first steamboatmen were flat and keelboatmen because they were from that stock. They knew the river. All right. And so when the New Orleans finally gets to New Orleans, which is considered a huge success, right? Everybody is paying attention to this, right? Its engines could not propel it against the current of the Mississippi.
Okay.
It couldn't get back. All right. So when Elijah and Caleb Hunt decide they want to go into the mercantile business, when Elijah has to put in the corporate papers, right? So he travels to Philadelphia. And when he gets to Philadelphia, he meets a man by the name of Daniel French. Daniel French was a boat builder himself, but he was more interested in engines and boilers. And French had this idea, why use these low-pressure engines? Let's use a high-pressure engine, all right? And that's gonna be consequential throughout the steamboat history, right? Because we hear about explosions like Sultana killing people. There were explosions on the Monongahela River that killed people. It was like having a bomb basically in your boat that needed a safety valve, right? Like on a water heater.
Yeah.
Right. The overpressure valve.
And that's a good way. That's a good way of explaining it to people that don't know steam engines. Like you need like two giant hot water tanks, and just think of your hot water tank in your house. You don't want to be anywhere near that. If that thing were to go, now multiply that by 500, 1,000. That's an insane amount of pressure.
Yeah, there are stories about hot water heaters going in people's houses and they shoot through the roof, right? And so the steamboat engine the steamboat boilers and engines were very much similar. And it took a long time for them to put that pressure release valve on. And even then, captains and engineers would put bricks or weights on it, keep it closed, right?
Yeah, because time is money. If they can go faster, they can make more trips and they can make more money.
they were the 19th century truckers, you know. So French said, "We're going to put he said, I can build you a boat, Elijah, that'll go down to the Mississippi, to go down New Orleans and come back under its own power." And so Elijah said, "All right, let's do it." Brownsville's a prominent town. There's a lot of money in that town. This would make a lot of money. So in the spring, this is around 1812 or so, 1813, they formed the Monongahela and Ohio Steamboat Company, all right? And they also form another business called the Bridgeport Woolen Mill, okay? And I've done some research on that. I believe they just tore the building down a few years ago. That was actually the mill itself, the mill house, which was across the street. It was an old, Gary, you'll probably remember this, it was an old white house across from the police station.
Yeah, they just tore it down a few years ago. Yeah, it was right on the corner there.
Yeah, it had all the trappings of an industrial structure. I wish we could have saved it.
I know, driving by every day to work, I know it didn't go down without a fight. It definitely fought to save its life. But I agree with you. Like that house, you pass it a million times, and just to know any of that history, even if there was a plaque there, would be amazing.
Absolutely. And so they formed these two companies, and Daniel French actually comes to Brownsville. I've been trying to locate where he lived in Brownsville. It's so difficult, but he lived in Bridgeport, but he actually drags his steam engines and boilers over the Alleghenies, brings them into Brownsville. And so, building a boat's expensive, so they get these investors involved, all right? So they get a flatboatman, keel boatman named Israel Gregg, who's also a merchant, and they get a man by the name of Henry Shreve, all right? Shreve is perhaps the most important person in the history of steamboats and steamboat building that you will find, all right? Henry Shreve was an innovator. He knew what was going on. And so in 1814, and I'll explain that, in 1814, they build the Steamboat Enterprise. What a fitting name, right? Steamboat Enterprise. And it looks very much like the New Orleans, all right? It's got a bow, like a boat, V-hull. It's got a single deck with a pilot house on it. It has a mast. It's
state of the art for the time, right?
State of the art. And its hardware, though, is different because the engines kind of sit horizontally, but it's a stern wheel. So the paddle wheel's in the back of the boat, all right? On its first journey, because when you build a steamboat in Brownsville, it went to Pittsburgh to get put in the records, okay? And so Israel Gregg is the captain, the master, as they call him. Henry Shreve is the pilot, all right? And there's some crew on board. Rogers, I'm trying to think of his name. Robert Rogers, who, what a hero of mine from Brownsville. He was a merchant. He was a potter. He made Queen Anne ware in Pittsburgh. He was kind of a Renaissance guy. Owned a tenement house right across from it's Picker's Pub now. The parking lot you sit in?
Yeah.
He owned a tenement house there. He was a real go-getter. And he was on board this first trip. And so Israel Gregg pilots the boat up to Pittsburgh. It takes about 5 hours to get there. And they pilot it back down for the first sort of shakedown, right? Afterwards, Henry Shreve becomes the captain of the boat for its next journey, which is to New Orleans, all right? And I believe the reason why they picked Shreve was because he was a flatboatman and a keel boatman, all right? He knew the river. He had been working on the river. He was an entrepreneur of his own right. He was a very, very go-getter, much a go-getter.
When you also probably, if there's an investment like that, you want your best guy in charge of it so you don't end up with matchsticks in a grounded boat.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You want the best guy that you can get. And Henry Shreve was it, all right? He was born in New Jersey. His father comes from New Jersey out west to make a better life. passes away at an early age with Henry. But Henry lived in Brownsville. He lived on Front Street, okay? And he will become a war hero during this journey, okay? The War of 1812 hero. And so what happens is Henry Shreve takes the Enterprise out in 1814. And the journey, they have to wait for the higher water. Remember, we got this V-bottom boat. Mm-hmm. He gets to New Orleans, all right? And a couple things happen, all right? One, the War of 1812 is going on. The Enterprise is commandeered by the U.S. military, all right? I mean, this is it. Nobody even talks about this. This could have been put in the blog post. The Enterprise becomes the first steamboat used in war.
Anywhere.
They put munitions on this thing, and they put troops on it, and they use it as a troop carrier.
And that probably was as revolutionary as during the Civil War with the ironclad. So, I mean, something like that lost to history.
Could you imagine if you were a British soldier and you saw that thing coming down the river?
Go the other way.
Right? I mean, yeah, you maybe you saw some steamboats in Britain on the rivers, but you never saw anything like this. This is purely an American invention. All right, the steamboat's purely American as far as the design is, and so that vessel gets used in the war. Henry Shreve ends up manning a gun, some kind of artillery piece during the battle, staving off the British. Becomes a war hero. They named Shreveport after him, Shreveport, Louisiana. He gets back on the boat. They give him back the boat. All right. He goes to leave, and then he gets arrested. The whole boat gets secured for violation of the patents that Fulton and Livingston and Roosevelt had. All right.
So even then, there's litigation everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, he's held up. The guy escapes at night, gets back on the Enterprise, steamers up back to Pittsburgh, and then eventually back to Brownsville. All right. If you get rid of the middle part where he's fighting and it's being used, the journey takes about 20 days.
Okay.
All right. That's like going from propeller aircraft to jet power, right? 6 months? No. 20 days, right?
And that's going to inspire commerce, trade, commerce, travel. I mean, that opens up an entire frontier, an entire industry. Industries.
It did. It completely changed the way business was done on the river towns. And let's face it, every town is on the river at this point. Mm-hmm. You needed water to power industry. You needed water for transportation, to get your flatboats, your keelboats, your bateaus, all of that. Nobody wanted to ride that horseback on the roads. They're even more dangerous. You've got, natives out there. You've got highwaymen. You got natural problems, right? Weather, trees falling, and stuff like that. I mean, there's a whole gamut of stuff. So Henry Shreve, he looks at the Enterprise and he says, this damn thing's all wrong. It was a good boat. It made it. All right. Israel Gregg takes it again, becomes captain of it again. It kind of stays out of history after that, right? But Shreve looks at it and he says, this is all, the design is wrong for what we need it for. And so I want you to think, and I got some pictures for you, Gary.
Okay.
But I want you to think about a Mississippian Mark Twain steamboat. Okay. How did we get from this ocean-going looking boat with a mast and V-bottom to that flat bottom? And all like a layer cake of decks on it to make it look like a wedding cake, right? Mm-hmm. Gingerbread and all that, just the romanticized version of it, right?
Kind of like the boats in Pittsburgh.
Absolutely, yeah, like the Gateway Clipper.
Gateway Clipper fleet, yep.
Yeah, totally fake steamboats, right?
Yeah.
So, it's Shreve. Shreve says, I'm going to redesign this vessel, all right? And so around I think it's 1816, maybe 1818. I'm a little fuzzy on it. But look, doesn't matter. What he did is he created a flat bottom boat. All right. He put the boilers horizontally. All right. Instead of vertically. Put them horizontally. The engines are horizontal. All right. They stick out of the back. He put a boiler deck up on top of that. Okay. A housing for the boilers and engine room. On top of that, he places a saloon. All right. They were main hallways, saloon. And in that, you could have staterooms. Okay. They credit Henry Shreve with coming up with staterooms, like the Pennsylvania room.
Okay.
Connecticut room.
Yeah.
Right. He's the first one to name them, supposedly, on boats. Right now, they're all over. It's all over. It's even hotels now, right? And so, on top of that deck, because he's not done yet, he has the Texas deck. Okay. And you can have your staterooms up there. Usually your captain, your officer stayed there, stewards, pursers. Okay. And on top of that was the pilot house. All right. And, one day, Gary, I would love to do, my whole thing are steamboat workers. Who worked on these boats? What was it like to be a worker on a steamboat in the 19th century? That's my passion right there. That's what I wrote my dissertation on.
Well, we definitely have more time. We can do that as a separate show, but without a doubt.
Yeah, I interviewed a bunch of people from Brownsville and local areas who worked on the boats, right, to get an idea. But Henry Shreve builds this boat. It's called the Washington, all right? And it is the first, what I would call, Western steamboat that reflects the Mississippian sort of design, right? Mm-hmm. You'll see there are boats that plied the Monongahela River that weren't nearly as ornate, right? They were flimsy. They were fire traps, right? An explosion waiting to happen. But all of them had the same design. Flat bottom, boilers horizontally in the boiler deck. You had either stern or side wheel configuration. And you always had a deck up on top of the boilers for your crew to stay in, or passengers, right?
And that's all coming from the mine of Shreve, correct?
All coming from the mine of Shreve, okay? Because he understood how the river was. The Mississippi River, there's some great drawings of it on how many times it's changed. Mark Twain mentioned the Mississippi River changed every day, okay? It constantly, sandbars came and went, snags. Shreve understood if you get that boat on a sandbar with a deep V hull,
it's not going anywhere.
Okay, and let me tell you, so the Enterprise was the first boat built in Brownsville. It's actually like the fourth boat built on Western waters. Mm-hmm. All right, there was one before. The second boat, I think, was called the Comet, built in Pittsburgh. Never really amounted to much either, but at the same time they build the Enterprise, they build another boat called the Dispatch. Mm-hmm. Okay. Same sort of configuration as the Enterprise. It gets hung up on a sandbar for days. Those guys are stuck in the river. Okay. And they have to wait for the water to come up. They have guys in the water. Because remember, the one thing that we didn't talk about, that we talked about a few days ago, the Monongahela River was very different then as it is now.
Walk across it.
Walk across it.
Yeah.
It's a stone bottom. I've been scuba diving in there right off the Brownsville Wharf. It's a rock bottom. You see all the sediment in there? Okay, just think to yourself, it wasn't always like that. The sediment is from, the 8 to 16 feet of water height that we've done with the damming, mm-hmm. and the sediment coming off of the river banks. But it was never supposed to be that high. It's a rock bottom river. You can walk across it in dry periods. There are waterfalls and rapids on it.
Which is just mind-blowing.
It is, right?
Well, let me ask a question for a point of reference. Would the modern-day Youghiogheny, would that be kind of similar to what the Monongahela was historically?
Well, you could use that. The Youghiogheny is kind of a rough river. And actually, for a period of time, there were some navigable parts of it that were maintained for navigation. But I would say that's pretty close. You could think of it like that. You could think of it like Dunlap Creek, actually.
Okay.
A little bit wider. You know, the only way I can explain it is if you come to Michigan and you see a Michigan River, and then what they call a river, and then you look at the Monongahela River, and you say, in Michigan there are no rivers, right? But there are, right? But they're like a creek. They're like Dunlap Creek or Redstone Creek, you know. And so the Monongahela River, which Monongahela in Algonquin is river with steep falling banks, was rather flat and wide. It flowed north. It flows north, which means it was very easy to get to points west. Henry Shreve builds the boat, the Washington. And see, this is the complexity that they couldn't capture in the blog post, right? They couldn't capture all of this, and instead they kind of glossed over it, right?
Yeah. And you need the background information for just to build the story, because if you just say, you know, in a post, Henry Shreve took a boat to New Orleans. Well, yeah. You've talked for 15, 20 minutes about, like, you know, telling stories about, you know, boats getting stuck, you know, men pulling trees. Well, I mean, nuance.
But the thing is, like, you read the blog post. Yeah, you read the blog post, you think these incidents happen in a vacuum, right? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the problems with history, probably as it's taught, but that these events happen in these capsular, sort of unrelated events, right?
Yeah. And that's not the case.
Henry Shreve, Elijah. So, okay, ultimately what happens is Elijah and Caleb Hunt and Daniel French, they're not making any money, all right? Because they're not very good businessmen. Ultimately, the woolen mill closes down. Their boat company dissolves. The Monongahela and Ohio Steamboat Company basically dissolves. They're just not very good at it. Maybe they were good at boat building and should have stuck with that, right? Or maybe they were good at the woolen stuff and they should have had Henry Shreve doing the steamboat stuff. It's lost to history, but they didn't do very well. They go out pretty quick. But what happens in Brownsville is that as soon as you have the steamboat company, then you have Jacob Bowman, all right? Not the original Jacob Bowman, the son. One of the things that we should talk about one day is how you go take the castle tour, and they talk about Jacob Bowman as if he's one person, when there's like
several Jacob Bowmans.
Several Jacob Bowmans throughout time doing different things. But he builds a boatyard. You have John Cock Boatyard. You have the Pringle Boatyard, all right? And Brownsville's landscape is different, right? We see a walled city, walled to the river. And we think to ourselves, how could they have built boats here, right? People have, you know, when I excavated the Snowden Vulcan Iron Machine Works, somebody came up to me and actually said to me, I don't ever remember there being a foundry there. Well, that's probably true.
Yep.
You know, it was done and buried in 1890.
Yeah.
Okay? But it had started earlier. Okay. And the reason was it was spurred on by this industry in Brownsville. And it's directly tied to the steamboat era that John Snowden, you know, he's making all these stoves in Brownsville. And William Hogg, who's a famous business guy, is pumping money into him to build the foundry as an investor. And John Snowden builds steamboats. He builds boilers. He builds engines. You know, and let me tell you, there's one John Snowden engine left in this world.
Where is it located?
It is located in Kansas City, Missouri.
Okay.
There was a boat, the Arabia.
Okay.
Some of your viewers probably already recognize it.
I was hoping you would touch on it because it's an amazing story in itself.
It is. Do you know the story, Gary?
I know the basics.
Okay. Treasure hunters in the 80s, early 90s, hearing tales of the steamboat wreck, go searching in the Mississippi River by Kansas City, Missouri. And they've come across a farmer who said, well, you know, I was plying my field and I hit this piece of metal. right? That piece of metal was the top of the stack of this steamboat, the Arabia, sticking out of the ground.
And
so
think
they
about that.
excavated all the way around.
But I was going to say, think about what Mark just said. He was plowing a field.
That's how much the river moved, right? And so they excavate this boat, which was built in Brownsville, Steamboat Arabia, 1856, built in Brownsville. Had its engines made at the John Snowden and Sons foundry in Brownsville. Its boilers, they're not sure. They think they might have been made in Pittsburgh. Because in the middle period here, in the 1850s, when these boats are being built, what you would do is you would build the hulls in like Axton and Pringle Yard, John Cocken Yard. And you would float the hulls to, say, John Snowden, and he would outfit all the machinery, right? The pumps, the engines, the boilers, maybe the boilers. Maybe he didn't do boilers at that period where he's like, well, I've got too many engines.
Mm-hmm.
We'll send the boat to Pittsburgh. Because in Pittsburgh, that's where you get all of your accoutrement, all of your staterooms, your furniture, your fine wood cuttings. You would get your steamboat boiler placed in there. You would have your interiors done. And industry was different back then than it is now, right? There's competition. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't unheard of to have expert boat builders in Brownsville go work in Pittsburgh for a few months on a boat.
So this industry we're talking about is basically a 40-mile industry from Brownsville to Pittsburgh.
Oh, yeah. Elizabeth,
mm-hmm.
Belle Vernon, they're building – California's building boats, right? There were steamboats built in California at their boat yards. And so it's a very interconnected industry, right? They're not out to bury one another.
Mm-hmm.
They're out to help each other grow, okay? And through this whole time period, you have, which if you ever get to the Arabian Museum, I'll send you a picture of it.
Okay.
The John Snowden and Son engine has this really cool Greek god face on it. All right. Nobody knows what it is. It's fascinating. But it's stamped in it, in the cast iron, cast into the cast iron. But that's only one that has survived. And when I went there to the museum, the docents, day after day, have been hearing about Brownsville, right? And so I told them where I was from and what I was doing. I was a researcher, and I needed some documentation. The docent got me, and she's like, hold on, I got to get everybody else. And they gathered all these people around. And they're like, this is Marc Henshaw. He's from Brownsville, where they built the Steamboat Arabia. And I had people ask me questions like, what's it like there? Are they still building boats? Is there museums? The industry? And then you tell them the truth, and you just see them bow their heads like I just, told them you're all fired, like it's sad, right? The room darkened a bit.
That's what something I was going to break in for a second. That's why I think it's so important. We when you having these ideas, these talks, because if no one's telling the history goes away. Absolutely. Just in this, we've been talking for about a half hour now, and we've connected Brownsville to New Orleans, Shreveport, Louisiana, Kansas City, squirrel migration into the Mississippi, one of the largest earthquakes in human history. Yeah. And that's just, in a 25-minute period I was talking, but also historically, that's only probably in about, a 75-year period that we're talking to. And Mark, just for a point of reference for our viewers at home, that most of them are going to be familiar with Brownsville, some may not, but for point of reference, where would these shipyards be? Like you referenced that, if you cross the bridges in Brownsville, you see the walls that are holding up the train tracks and, from the former lock and dam system. But where, if we're looking from the Lane Brain Bridge to the left all the way down past where the baseball field is in West Brownsville, like, is that about where the area we're talking about?
Yeah, well, the John Snowden and Son Vulcan Iron Machine Works, which built steamboats and boilers and engines, was located right behind the Flatiron Building, all right, which is now right beside the Union Station Building, which didn't exist at the time. The John Pringle and Sons boatyard was located at the Bridgeport Wharf, which would have been down by, I guess would have been somewhere down along Lock 5 Wall, down in that area. Because where Fiddle's Restaurant is now today was the Herbertson foundry, on the same block as Fiddles, and it produced steamboat engines and boilers there. James Herbertson, he had worked in the foundry as an apprentice under Snowden. But when we look at the landscape of the town, right, we had the railroad tracks. Those railroad tracks didn't come into Brownsville until 1902. Okay. So before that, Brownsville was very much open to the river. All right, with gently sloping banks to the river.
That's mind-blowing. That's just mind-blowing.
Right? It looks like a walled city, like I mentioned before.
Yeah.
So it was very open to the river. And in 1856, okay, the 1850s, the railroad comes as far as Cumberland, Maryland.
Okay.
All right. There are protests in Brownsville and the National Road to keep the railroad out.
Wow. Because it would be jeopardizing the huge industry. Because
where are they going to put the railroad?
Yeah.
Along the river, right? And they're going to seal the town off. Well, I think that Pringle understood this, right? He's one of the largest book producers in Brownsville. So he moves across the river to where Dukeman's Beer Distributor now stands, okay? Because remember, we had the covered bridge going across, right? The intercounty bridge, it's there now, was covered at one time.
Okay.
Horses crossed and things like that. And Pringle, he opens his business up right on the banks of the Mon, right where Dukeman's Beer Distributor is and his ice house, in that area, okay? And so a lot of these other, like John Cock, who was started off in Bridgeport, moves over to West Brownsville. And he moves over, you know, if you're headed down the intercounty bridge and Dukeman's is on the left, John Cox would have been slightly down the river on the right.
Okay.
John Snowden's son's out of business by the time the railroad comes in. All right. Their foundry gets converted to tenement structures for coal mining. Okay. But what happens is the railroad comes in, it's completely walls off the town, right? Completely cutting off Brownsville from its once extremely lucrative river resource, right, that built it. And so that's sort of the transition, right? People talk about Brownsville dying all the time. Brownsville almost died many times in the 1870s, okay? And the reason is in the 1870s, the frontier is settled. They call it closed. There's papers that say the western frontier is closed. We've settled all of it. And those industries that fueled that immigration boom, your nail factories, your foundries, your mercantile businesses, they're done. They're done, okay, 1870s. But at the same time, the first coal mines open up, all right? John Snowden's son, William E. Hogg and his son, they open up coal mines in the 1870s, all right? If you look at the graph in coal mine production or coal production, bushels being sent from Brownsville to Pittsburgh on the river, it becomes this long, steady increase, all right? Nobody's pushing that stuff in the 1850s, all right? The boats were using coal. They had coaling barges that would come up alongside them, and they'd get coaled from that if they were, you know, somewhere. But most of your mining wasn't being done in Brownsville or the region there. It was being done north, okay? Now, to say that Brownsville shot itself in the foot by going from this multidisciplinary, multi-versatile economy of shops and such in manufacturing to being reliant on one thing, coal mining, right? One thing. And once that was gone, what do you get?
There's no other things to fall back on.
You get decay, right?
Yeah.
You get urban decay, post-industrialization seeps in, people move out. Lane Main Bridge gets constructed, just guts the market district. The oldest market district west of the Appalachian Mountains gets gutted by the Lane Main Bridge.
And you beat me to the question, because I was going to ask, could you see a parallel between what was happening when the railroads went into that industry to what happened whenever the highways and Lane Main Bridge went in the 50s, 60s, and 70s?
Yeah, and for the steamboat industry, the railroad becomes really a dogged competitor, okay? There are documents to show that the intercounty bridge, when they built it, which is of railroad design, right? It looks just like the railroad bridge down by Albany.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they built it too low, and they built it too low for a reason. They didn't want the steamboats competing with coal transportation that the railroads were doing. And I'm going to send you a picture of a steamboat at the Brownsville Wharf with its stacks cantilevered,
Okay.
so that it could get underneath the bridge.
Wow.
Right? They built all the bridges in Pittsburgh too low. Some boats, which were huge, like the Columbia, okay, they could only do their trade, as they say, their travels between certain points because they couldn't get under the bridges. Their decks were too high. They didn't even have the option of cantilever.
Jeez, a whiz.
The decks were too high, all right? And this happens all the way through the Ohio, all the way down the Mississippi, okay? Bridges being built too low to stop the steamboat industry. Steamboat industry can carry acres and acres of coal, all right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it. That's competition to the railroad.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The other thing that is going on with this whole thing is that you're getting better roadways too, which are competing with the steamboat industry. Instead of being a major mode of transportation, cars are introduced, right? Horseless carriages. And so there's a lot of pressure on the boat industry that it's just out of their control because technological change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Technological change. And so, I write about this stuff. I wrote my dissertation on it because it's fascinating. The people who work there towards the end. But to get an idea, you can see their lives on the river as a direct correlation to those in the 1830s, 1840s. The technology didn't change, right? Sure, you had some boats that had these automatic augers for coal, right? Mm-hmm. Self-coaling, whatever. Didn't change. Captains at one time were celebrities in town. You read the newspapers like the Clipper or the Telegraph, and when a steamboat captain left Brownsville and went to Pittsburgh, they wrote about it. Mm-hmm. Or when they came into town, they wrote about it. A steamboat captain in the 1870s could own his own boats. He might own some stock in a bank. I'm thinking of Michael Cox on Church Street, who I studied. Michael Armacost Cox. He was a boat captain. He was a investment banker in the Monongahela Bank. He sat on their board. He owned stock in coal companies. He was very diversified, right? Mm-hmm. And if we compare that to somebody in the 1850s, they were just steamboat captains.
Yeah.
Right. They made all their money by doing and helping with the industry, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe they got better things because they had some social capital. They could bargain or barter. Hey, look, yeah. I'll carry your cargo for a discount on shingles for my house, right? So stuff like that. That kind of goes away as capitalism kind of creeps in a little bit more and replaces the frontier economy that was going on in the 1850s. Because remember, the 1870s, frontiers closed. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so the industry in town is really, the National Road was trying to put out something to spark interest, and I believe it did that. Mm-hmm. I believe that now we can have a conversation about it. We can talk about every building we've lost in Brownsville, having some connection to some industry or to some famous person, and mourn its loss, right?
Yeah, and this definitely could be a jumping off point for everything because, like you said, at the very least, it spurred this conversation. I know on the message that we both saw, I mean, that wasn't just one or two responses. There was a healthy conversation back and forth, and it was all fairly positive. And as we mentioned before, like, these stories need to be told or else they're just going to be forgotten. And, Brownsville being one of the historical, just from a historical standpoint, is interesting, let alone the fact that we both, grew up there and, have heavy ties to the area. I mean, that makes it interesting as well. But just as we talked about a little bit ago, you've touched on connections between New Orleans, Shreveport, Kansas City, 5 or 6 different industries converging right, downtown. It's just amazing how pivotal, Brownsville and to some extent the Brownsville area and greater area had in how this country became to be settled and industry was, invented and prospered in Brownsville.
Well, the other thing, we didn't even talk about the lock and dam system. I mean, if it wasn't for Brownsville, there'd be no lock and dam system on the Monongahela River. I mean, they championed it. But one final point. So, the railroad gets held up in Cumberland, right, in 1856 because people on the National Road and people are, complaining about it. They don't want it to come in. It's going to destroy business. But when it comes in 1802, the people are rejoicing, right, because it's bringing new business in. And there are editorials in the newspaper of some of these business owners who are going, you know what, we told you, 20 years ago, this was going to be a good thing. And you guys stopped it.
Now you're 20 years behind where they could have been.
Yeah, now there's the famine period. Because, see, the railroad was already in West Brownsville, all right? The railroad was already set back because West Brownsville sits on a major floodplain, a flat, wide floodplain. The railroad was already set back so that those boatyards could just come in. They had no threat of being walled off. There was no inkling that they would get, cut off from doing that.
Yeah, and I know in one of our future talks, I want to talk a little bit about because I know there's still some historical businesses or not businesses, but historical structures on the West Brownsville side that you can still drive by today. And, if you drive by them, you don't know what, amazing and things happen. And, it's just unbelievable. Some of the history that you with, being in cars and, this fast paced world of ours, you just drive by and don't even realize that, that was a major point of industry. Oh, that was a major point of commerce. Oh, there was a glass factory there that, championed a new version of glass making.
Right. There was a glass factory in Brownsville.
Yeah.
I mean, it's mind-blowing, right? It's mind-blowing. I took students when I worked at Cal there on a field trip down to a place called Mitchell Hollow, which is down on 2nd Street, right where Hollow Road goes up. There's a little hollow down there on the one side. And we were looking at what appears to be a steam engine mount. Okay, the remnants of a steam engine mount there. And Bill Tracy took me down there and his brother. He's like, what would it be doing here? And you look at the 1856 map and there's a colliery there, a coal mine.
Wow.
That was supplying Brownsville with some coal, a little personal sort of family-run coal mine, right? Guy needs steam engine to pump out the water. And there was the mount. It sits there in the woods, alone, right? In an area nobody even thinks about, Mitchell Hollow. Who even thinks about that?
Yeah, I mean, you drive by it once in a blue moon.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Maybe. So there's these little tidbits of history all over that area that just, there's even someone who contacted me looking for the hand guard. Okay? The hand guard was built in the 1750s by Trent and Grist as they were coming across the Nemacolin Path into the French area. We were occupied, with French occupied area. And they built the hand guard, which was a munitions depot, a fort, called more like a log structure that held munitions and ammunition, a storehouse, right? And it gets burned in the French and Indian War in the 1750s. And it sat at the mouth of Redstone Creek.
Okay.
And so we've had that conversation. We've had the conversation with locals about Fort Byrd. Where was Fort Byrd? There's competing talk of being at the castle. I don't believe that for a minute. Colonel Byrd's diary says it was on a low bank of the Monongahela River.
That's definitely not where the castle is.
No, I believe it was down by where Cart's or G.C. Murphy's was.
Okay.
Right there. Because why are you going to porter your boats? You have canoes and bateaus and stuff. All the merchandise, you're going to have to porter it up to the...
You're not going to take them up a 200-foot hill.
And then if you stand at the top of the hill, what kind of military site do you have up or down the river? You have no sight distance.
It'd be very easy to be ambushed because people would come right up the cliff and you're surprised.
That's right. So Byrd wasn't stupid. He put it at the low bank, like he says in the diary, because he also says in his diary that there were saw pits across on Nemacolin Creek. And Nemacolin Creek is Dunlap Creek. That's the original name of it. And that's where they hewed the logs for Fort Byrd. So I'm fairly confident it's underneath Cart's or Murphy's
Yeah, I mean, based on his diary, without a map, that's about as close as you can get to drawing a circle on a map as you can
Yeah.
with his description.
Hey, the other thing is, the fort was around in the early 19th century.
Okay.
Talk about something that gets lost. They used to have festivals there. Michael Cressup, who was a famous pioneer, built the first, legend has it, built the first shingled roofed house west of the Appalachian Mountains, would go to Fort Byrd all the time for provisions. So it was there. It was up in the early 19th century. It may still have been up during the steamboat era.
And one last, or go ahead. I'm sorry, Mark.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. I was going to make one point about Michael Cressup.
I'm passionate about this stuff.
Was Michael Cressup, he founded Cressuptown, Maryland, correct?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. The only reason I know about Cressuptown, Maryland, a good friend of mine lives there, and I'd like to have something to hang over his head.
Oh, well, you know what? We could always look that up. He was they say he murdered an Indian chief and started Lord Dunmore's War in 1775, which was sort of like I don't know what you want to call like a precursor to the Revolutionary War. But they think that's false.
Okay.
I think that's false. So.
Well, I think that's a good place the murder and starting wars is probably a good place to draw this conversation to a close. But sure. We're definitely gonna have more of this because these stories need to be told, and we've gone into industry, we've gone into international murder and war starting, we've gone into squirrel migrations. But Mark, thank you for taking some time.
Maybe Lord Dunmore's War was 1770. I'm having a little bit of a break here, but
we'll give you a few weeks to get that right.
You gotta give me a pass on that one.
Yeah, I mean, the stuff you've said before, like this entire show, you're good for one little slip up. So
okay, thanks. I appreciate it.
And especially like I said, if we can keep getting the setting the record straight and talking about the fascinating story that is Brownsville and Western PA, like that, I think that is a great service to everyone.
Yeah, I love this, Gary. Thanks for having a platform here that we can talk about this and get people interested and maybe get them out in the streets a little bit, helping brighten up the town and really taking a look at what's the history that's around them.
I like the sound of that. So thanks once again to my guest Marc Henshaw today, and we'll see you next time on A Conversation With.